Heinz Professor of Sustainable Communities in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning in the School of Architecture at UVA. He's been there for the last 25 years in a teaching capacity, as well as research. He holds a PhD in city and regional planning from UNC Chapel Hill. So he's an alum.
Yes, true.
Like a lot of you will soon be. Yay!
Yay!
He holds an MA in political science from UNC, a master's in urban planning from the University of Oregon, and a bachelor's of city planning from UVA. Among other studies, Tim's work focuses on sustainable communities and how cities and towns can reduce ecological footprints while becoming more livable and equitable places. And I'm assuming you guys all caught that based on the readings that Tim provided. He's currently working on a project funded by a Rapid Response Grant to study nature as a pandemic response, which, is a very timely topic. He is a prolific and accessible writer. He's an author or co-author of more than 15 books on a wide range of subjects.
Here it is.
Yes, there it is. And if you can squint with the glare,
I can't quite see it. Can you?
My name on there.
Yes.
So yes, it 2 editions so far. Needs updating on
coastal
management.
Can you believe it? It's 20 years old almost.
That's right. David Brower and yours truly. So I've known Tim for a very long time, long enough that coastal zone management has completely changed.
Yeah.
So it's good for historical perspective if you want to pick up that book.
Yeah.
So, even that before then, climate change and sea level rise they were known, but not on the radar. So you guys have come a long way, and it's you that are going to carry the baton on.
They are, yeah.
So Tim's book, Ethical Land Use, was declared by the APA to be one of the 100 essential books in planning. So I hope all of you planning students are going to make that part of your library. And non-planners, you'll also benefit a lot from his text. So having said all that, thank you, Tim, so much for being here. And you can start sharing your screen. Okay. We're going to let Tim go through his presentation in full before taking questions. And now you can put them in the chat if something just really strikes you as incredibly fascinating. Otherwise, I'm going to be choosing at random from the questions that you pre-submitted. So obviously, I can't get to everybody's questions, but we'll see how this goes. Tim is graciously being our guinea pig for me in this interactive portion of our class. So we'll see.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be with you and to have a relatively small group. I was just saying that in the fall, we haven't started yet here at UVA. We've got another week before we start, a little bit behind you. But in the fall, my big fall class was 250 students in an introduction to urban planning course. And it's always a fun class, but that's a little bit big to do on Zoom. This is a lot more manageable. By the way, I think this book it's still relevant. This one that we did, we're going to dedicate the talk today to Dave Brower, who is a wonderful friend and colleague to us, and the co-author of this book, and somebody I think about a lot all the time. And so we'll kind of channel good feelings from Dave. He was a longtime professor in the planning department. You probably don't know much about him or have not heard much about him, but he has had a lot to do with both of our professional trajectories.
Absolutely. And I'm very quickly, sorry to interrupt him, but I'm going to share Dave's mantra where he said there's no such thing as a natural disaster.
Right.
It's a natural hazard.
That's right.
It's only until it intersects with the human environment. Now, today, that's probably not a shocking revelation to the students, or I hope it's not, which means that message has been getting out a little bit more.
That's
but
true.
Back in the day, it was not. And it was resistance
Yeah,
to
we have,
to hazards. No resilience stuff. We did
yeah,
talk about sustainability, but
yes, you did.
so this is just a new way of talking about natural hazards, remembering that they are natural, part of nature,
Yep.
and humans interfere or get in the way.
Yeah, we
That's
built
when a
things in
disaster.
floodplains and put people and property in places it shouldn't be. But yeah, well, with that, let's jump in. And so I have probably many more slides than we can cover in say 30 or 40 minutes. But I'm at some point, if you all would give me some kind of a 30-minute or 40-minute, if I'm getting too long, just tell me to stop, and I will. But my goal today is really to introduce this idea of a natureful city, what we call a biophilic city. And really the combination of these, I'm mixing a lot of things together today. So it's about biophilia, the connections to nature, the power of nature, but it's also about resilience. And I know this is the first lecture you've had in this resilience lecture series. So I have want to talk about that a bit. And then I want to combine those things and talk about the pandemic, which, as was said, we're starting to do some work around understanding how cities are responding to the pandemic. Let's see, I'm going to minimize the photos here and go right to the screen. So this is the sort of the key argument that I'm going to make today, which is that nature and connections to nature do many things for us. Nature has this powerful impact, positive impact for the most part, and that the whole concept of biophilia is that we need nature. We're drawn to nature. We have an innate connection with the natural world, and the many benefits are delivered, are a result from that close contact with nature that help to make us healthier, happier, and more resilient. So the more natureful our cities will be, the more we design nature into our cities and communities, the more resilient they will be. And many of these things are pretty clearly demonstrated during the pandemic. So this is essentially the argument that I'm going to make today. So we started talking about this idea of biophilic cities around 2010, 2011. There's a little book that I did called Biophilic Cities. We started something called the Biophilic Cities Project here at UVA that has now turned into a global network of cities, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about. But it is this idea that doesn't seem very radical now, but that we need cities and nature together. And so if we want to address climate change, if we want to create cities that allow for walking and bicycling and investments in transit, they need to be dense. They need to be dense and compact. And that's usually that usually raises the question, well, if they're dense and compact, does that mean there's no room for nature? And we say absolutely there is. And so take away that question mark. We can and must be designing for places that have that have that density and also have the nature. So we have to give a lot of credit to E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson, who's a professor at Harvard, was a professor at Harvard, is really retired now, but still writing books. This is one definition, but he's really the one who has coined this term in the way that we use it today, that we've co-evolved with the natural world, that we, again, are happier, healthier, able to lead meaningful lives when we have nature all around us. And a big part of the argument here is that it isn't just nature that you get once or twice on a holiday or on a vacation. We have to design it in. It has to be all around us in those places where we spend most of our time. So it has to be in the neighborhoods where we live in cities, and it has to be in and around where we're working and where we're, again, spending most of our time. So there's a lot of evidence. I know you've gotten into this a little bit. I think we gave you something to read about this, but it seems like almost weekly there is a new study showing the impacts, the power, the positive connections to nature. For me, it's really pretty intuitive. I think it probably is for most of you. When you think about what it is that that gives you joy and delight and what we're drawn to. For me, it is definitely things in the natural world. It's flowers and living things, trees and butterflies and birds. I'm going to end up probably talking a lot about birds, but also water. And we have a lot of evidence that, again, not surprising, we co-evolved with nature, that we feel better. Our stress levels are lower, our anxiety levels are lower when we are around these things. And so there's a real clear, from my mind, connection between nature and health, and in particular mental health, which is where I think a lot of the discussion about the pandemic comes in. So here's just a little bit of little snippets of evidence to show you. An article from Bioscience, a study showing the relationship between greener neighborhoods with higher diversity of birds and greater tree canopy cover tend to be places where residents have lower levels of depression, anxiety, stress. I guess I just said that. Some of you know about the forest bathing research coming out of Japan, long-standing research showing that at the end of a walk through a forest, that our stress hormone levels go down, that we get a boost to our immune system from that walk in the forest. And the Japanese are so convinced about this that they've established a network of forest bathing stations around the country. So thinking about this from a resilience point of view, we can, in fact, be healthier, happier, have a greater ability to deal with things like pandemics when we have more nature around us. We could also spend a lot of time talking about the science of biophilia, even though we're still not entirely clear, why it is that nature makes us feel so much better. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with what we know about fractals. Fractals are these self-repeating natural shapes and forms. The tree you see where the leaf is a small version of the bow, which is a small version of the larger tree. A lot of evidence that we have evolved a visual system to more effortlessly process fractals. And you've got a quote here from Richard Taylor, who's the chair of the physics department. He's done a lot of the work around this idea of fractal fluency, that we've evolved this visual system. And so just about everything, it seems like, that brings us joy in the world has some geometry, some fractal geometry to it, whether that is a tree or feather patterns in birds. The image on the left, by the way, is from a really interesting initiative in the UK where they're using Birdsong as a way of evaluating hearing loss. It's also just sort of meant to remind me to just tell you that we've got this emerging evidence about the power of birdsong, and that in places, hospital places where in the UK and elsewhere where they've taped birdsong and are playing it back at particularly stressful times when kids are going into surgery or about to be inoculated, for example. So the totality of this is that there are so many ways that contact with nature improves our quality of life, again, improves our health, and especially our mental health. This is a slide that I tried to put together for a healthcare conference a couple of years ago, and found it really difficult to easily summarize what the research was telling us about nature. All of these things that you see on the right are indeed connected with the presence of nature. I've mentioned stress, anxiety, improved mood, happiness. We have evidence that crime goes down, gun violence is lower when we have nature, trees, investments in nature. Evidence coming out of social psychology and economics that we're actually more likely to be generous in the presence of nature, more likely to be cooperative, more likely to think longer term. All these things that you could say, having nature around us, the presence of nature helps us, in fact, to be better human beings. to try to summarize it is hard, but we are frequently using the word flourishing as a way of doing that, partly because it means more than just enjoyment, pleasure. It means meaning and purpose and these other things that make life important and worth living. And nature is, for me anyway, and for many, is a big part of that. So to slide a little bit over to the pandemic, I think, it's commonly said, this is not an original insight, but that during these periods of lockdown, nature has been a saving grace, right? Nature has been this thing, the steadying thing in our lives. And it is definitely the case that we are doing things like bird watching, paying more attention to the nature around us. And it is a salve, it is a balm that's, helping us to get through this really tough time. So actually, these are two images from our Biophilic Cities network from two of our partner cities. On the left is Forest Park in Portland, Oregon. The right is Edmonton, Canada. So Forest Park on the left has experienced a kind of unprecedented demand, unprecedented folks wanting to spend time there during the pandemic, and they've done some really clever things of basically creating these one-way walking patterns to kind of maximize the number of people who can enjoy that park. The image on the right is actually from a really interesting regional green spaces plan called Breathe, which is wonderful in many ways. But this map shows, I think, what a lot of us are realizing or recognizing, reappreciating the spaces around us. It's definitely parks, but all of those spaces that our backyards, our front yards, street trees, the places we take walks, those spaces that may be more informal green spaces. We're seeing, nature all around us and recognizing the benefits of spending time outside. So I think one of the challenges will be to carry that forward after, when this pandemic is over, carrying it forward and harnessing that renewed sense of the importance of nature, both to change our lives in a way so that we spend more time doing things like bird watching, but also that we support the policy changes and the planning and the conservation work that we need to protect and restore that nature in our communities, and to make it a bigger part of the planning agenda maybe than it is. So we are learning a lot of things from COVID-19. So we have, in this project, have been trying to collect a lot of the stories from cities, particularly cities in our Biophilic Cities network. These are from San Francisco. There's the Slow Street network. A lot of cities that have closed streets or repurposed streets, and many of them have declared these closures, that these changes will be permanent. And we'll see, but we're trying to kind of capture a lot of the innovations that cities are engaging in, again, to make that outdoor connection, those contact with nature, the ability to see and hear things like birds more readily available during this tough period. So I have just finished a book about birds, a book called The Bird Friendly City, actually another Island Press book. It just came out in November. And so I have a few more slides about birds than maybe I normally would. But we have a lot of evidence, actually, that during the pandemic, there's been this sharp rise in interest in birds and in watching birds, and so we have a number of really interesting metrics. So a pretty dramatic increase in the web traffic of web pages like the Audubon Society, and downloads of bird identification apps, and actually on the commercial end, a rise in people, buying bird feeders and bird feed and things like that. And so we'll see whether it continues, but we have evidence, as these two stories indicate, that the greater the bird diversity, really the greater the biodiversity in a place, the happier we are likely to be in that place. And it is a kind of bird therapy. Actually, there's a guy who last year wrote a book called Bird Therapy, where he tells the story of how birds and bird watching really helped him to overcome some major challenges in his life. We did a webinar in the fall to a really large smart growth network, and I had the chance to ask a series of questions of the audience. And I asked them, here, I'm going to show you a couple of the answers, a couple of questions. How important was bird watching, or how important were birds? Actually, this is wrong. I should say how important were birds, I think, during the pandemic. And a lot of people, you see the percentages here. You don't see the percentages here, do you? That's interesting. I just did these slides, sorry. But a lot of people said birds and bird watching were extremely important or very important. And when we asked them, well, what was it you were doing? Percentages are here. Well, watching birds through windows. A lot of things happen, through windows, right? Listening to birds. A really high percentage of people were paying attention. And I've been getting a lot of questions about whether, are the birds louder than they used to be? They're not, but people are paying more attention, noticing birds, and doing things like bird watching walks in neighborhoods. So we'll see whether it continues, but it is therapy. It is stress reduction. It is doing meaningful things, even socially distanced, but often doing things with your family that involves nature. These are all really, really important things from the perspective of resilience, certainly individual and family resilience. So I promised I would say a little bit about resilience. You all are going to get a heavy dose of it in this lecture series, and you probably know there's just been this explosion of writing about resilience, an explosion in use of the word resilience. And sometimes we've done a couple of books about resilient cities that thinking about a city that's very dependent on fossil fuels, that's not a very resilient city. But it's also about the things we're talking about, Dave Brower. It's about natural hazards, certainly. But it's also about social resilience, and it's also about social equity. This is a cover. Barbara Brown Wilson is a professor in my department here at UVA who's written a book called Resilience for All, kind of looking at resilience through an equity lens. So this is a really useful and important lens for looking at the world. What is this idea of resilience? And you may get lots of definitions, and maybe you did this last week, but the Buzz Halling famous definition, of a capacity of a system to absorb and utilize and even benefit from perturbations and changes, and so persist without a qualitative change in the system structure. I think a lot of us are drawn to sort of more intuitive definitions like, rebounding, bending but not breaking. There's been a fair amount of critique of this way of thinking about resilience, and I have to give a little shout out to my colleague Nina Marie Lister at Ryerson University in Toronto. And she likes to say, resilience shouldn't really be about going back to some previous condition or restoring a community as it was. The world is constantly changing, it's constantly in a dynamic state. We want to not bounce back, but bounce forward. And here she's talking about the importance of seeing resilience as something that is proactive. Yes, we adapt, but we transform. That it is a way of an opportunity to stimulate radical transformation in a community. And so it's been really interesting to see how this applies during the pandemic because there are so many, places where we see these, stressed conditions, right? When people are in lockdown and one emerging example around nature is Singapore. And Singapore, I've got a few other slides about Singapore. Singapore has been a partner city in our Biophilic Cities network from the beginning. Wonderful story of incorporating nature in that city state. They had to go into a 2-month lockdown that they weren't really expecting to do. And what happened during that period was that the normal tending of the green spaces and the gardens around the city, things that would normally have been done by the National Parks Board in parks, really couldn't happen in the same way. So the city became a kind of pretty woolly and pretty wild. And has ignited a city-wide conversation about whether Singapore should think not of itself as a garden city or a city in a garden, but really as a city in wild nature. And the idea that residents we really want to see more wild things. We want to live in a city where there's greater connection to animals, for example, and it actually sort of builds on things that the city really has already been doing. That's a picture of smooth-coated otters, and some of you may know the story of Singapore's otters. There are about 80 now that have come back to the city in 10 or 12 different families, and the city is fascinated by these otters. It's not been completely conflict-free, but it's a city that is making room for that kind of wildness. In some ways, you can think of this as a Nina Marie Lister kind of an example of how a city is transforming itself through this opportunity of the pandemic. Terrible time, but also an opportunity. So I think they're going to it'll be really interesting to see moving forward whether many other cities take a similar position and what will happen after the pandemic is over. You've had all these news stories about animals occupying spaces, wild nature, urban wildlife coming in where humans are have left. We're locked in our apartments or in our houses, and we'll see how the perceptions of nature change. But it's all to the good. I think the ability to watch otters. By the way, we did a little 6-minute film, 6 or 7 minute film. That's me photographing one of them about the otters. And so if I forget to say this, I'm running out of time, I realize. We have a website, biophiliccities.org. Please take a look there. We have a film page. One of the things we've been doing is spending a lot of time capturing these stories through short films. And so there is a short film about the Singapore otters, which is really lovely. So I am running out of time. There are a lot of ways of defining resilience. A lot of folks have come up with different typologies, different ways of talking about conditions and qualities of community resilience. You may know Brian Walker and David Salt's important book, Resilience Thinking. Modularity is one of them typically. Diversity is certainly one of them. Social communities that are higher in social capital and innovation, overlapping governance. I think you'll probably get into a lot of this later in the semester. And urbanists and urban planners like Marina Alberti from the University of Washington, who has written this wonderful book, Cities That Think Like Planets, which is really about resilient cities. And it's also builds on very similar ideas and advocates for very similar attributes for what makes up a resilient place. But I will again, as I start to close here, make the case that resilience and nature are really go hand in hand, and just about anything that you can do to make a city more natureful and more biophilic will also make it more resilient. I know you watched a little bit of our Ocean Cities film. This is an image from Rotterdam, which makes an appearance in the film. Rotterdam is really invested in nature, subsidizing green rooftops, for example, and installing this idea of a water square or a water plaza. And you might have seen in the film the Bentham Line, the very first water plaza in Rotterdam. So the idea that you can add public space, you can create squares and gathering spaces that are green and natureful, but that also are designed to retain stormwater, and they look kind of like this. This is more of a kind of general rendering. It's not an actual water plaza, but the idea that a tiny little bit of the time it would be retaining water. And that's the trend that we see in many of our cities, the idea that you co-invest in infrastructure and designs that will deliver more nature, like Domino Park in New York City, but that are also very resilient and so that are floodable, and that like a wonderful example, Hunters Point South Park in Queens, which restores wetlands. This shoreline edge was all at a certain point all natural wetland. This restores some of those wetlands, and so for some of the time this would be a flooded park, but most of the time it's nature available. And we see this in many of our other cities. Of Singapore again, Bishan Park, a wonderful story of how the city converted what was a storm channel essentially into a natural meandering beautiful river, the most popular park in the city. And recent images from the storms they've been having shows that it works very effectively to retain the stormwater. It's designed to flood like this, to flood over its banks, and it's working perfectly. So when we design cities with more nature, we can make those cities more resilient at the same time. Okay, I said I had too many slides. I'm just going to go through, give you the 5-second version at this point and try to get to the end. I wanted to talk a little bit about biophilic buildings, building designs that make us better. We have a lot of films on the webpage about wonderful buildings like the Center for Sustainable Landscapes at the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh. This is a wonderful biophilic building, bringing in natural daylight, views of nature around it, a wonderful public green roof. If you have time to watch that film, it's really lovely. A lot of, I don't know how I thought I was going to get through all this, but a lot of literature and thinking and cases of biophilic design, largely focused at the building scale. Another case of a film we've recently made about the Frick Center in Pittsburgh, another biophilic building, and it's actually a living building challenge, a certified building. The Candida building in Atlanta is also an example of a biophilic building that also produces all the energy it needs. It's net zero energy, net zero water, use of a lot of local materials and biophilic materials like wood. So, and another example, the retrofit of what is now the headquarters for the Interface Carpet Company, which has this wonderful facade of more than 300 glass panels wrapped in a forest, a sheath in the form of a forest. So not living nature, but a biophilic design feature to be sure. So I do want to quickly go to just say a couple of words about the Biophilic Cities network. I have a few slides here. Again, I'm running out of time. Big point to make is that biophilic cities are cities that are cities full of biophilic buildings, we hope, but it's beyond that. It's everything in the city that can be a place for nature. It's the rooftop or room out to region or a bioregion, and all of the spaces in between, ideally interconnected. And this vision really is one of immersive nature. So here we're back to Singapore, and I think I'll stop here. Singapore, for many years, called themselves a garden city. More recently, they shifted their motto to city in a garden, the idea that, we want places of nature in a city, but we don't want to just have a park to go to. We want to kind of reimagine the very way a city is, that a city should be and is an ecosystem. And so we want to live in the park. We want to live in the forest. And we want to think of the city in that way. And so cities like Singapore have adopted a variety of mechanisms, planning tools to try to bring that about. This is the Park Royal Hotel, which has been designed by a wonderful firm called Woha. And this is a good example of the landscape replacement policy in Singapore that requires that when you build a building like this, you have to replace at least 1-to-1 the nature you've lost at ground level, and you replace it with nature in the vertical realm. So this is a building actually that replaces that nature 200%. And you see some of the kinds of nature at sky parks and green roofs and this kind of flowing nature over the sides of the facades. It's a really interesting idea, and a lot of friendly competition now in Singapore to see which building, which builder, which developer, which architect can design a building with the most nature in the vertical realm. So it is a whole of city approach. It is a view, a vision of the city that understands nature is all around us, and it's from indoor environments to outdoor environments, doing everything we can to overcome the barriers between indoor and outdoor. And again, a movement from seeing nature in cities as being kind of these limited, discrete points to understanding it as a system and understanding that city as a place of immersive nature. And again, with tremendous benefits in terms of resilience and in terms of mental health. Pittsburgh has been one of the cities in our Biophilic Cities network. And this is just an image to make the point that nature is everywhere. We may not necessarily see that bridge as nature, but it might be that there's a peregrine falcon nesting on it. And nature is the water, the river, the connections to water, the tree canopy, the places we make space for birds, ecological rooftops, and so on. So actually, Pittsburgh, when they joined the network, by the way, there's a lot of information about the joining requirements for cities. If they want to join as a partner city, one of the things they have to do is adopt a formal resolution, city council adopted resolution or proclamation. This is Mayor Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, receiving their certificate. Usually there's a celebratory event. This happened at the Phipps Conservatory, and we often get good press about cities joining the network. And we're up to 24 cities. Toronto just officially joined in the fall, and 24 on the way to maybe 100, we hope, and gaining traction. And this vision, this practice of biophilic urbanism and biophilic design is really taking off around the country and around the world. There's no one formula. There's no one model for what a biophilic city is, or the things that a city can do to enhance connections with nature. And so these are just examples of some of our partner cities and the different ways that they are strengthening those connections to nature. And here I'm just going to flip through Stream Daylighting Project in Vitoria-Gasteiz, the capital of the Basque Country, a wonderful conversion of a sterile water feature in Perth and Western Australia into a wonderful native wetland, biodiverse wetland. There's a 5-minute film about this story on the webpage as well. Richmond, Virginia, wonderful story of reconnecting to the James River. And the new chapter in the story is thinking about social equity, which is another key aspect of what a biophilic city is. We think nature is a birthright, so everyone is entitled to that nature, but we know with systemic racism and historic discrimination and segregation that particularly neighborhoods of color don't have the same levels of tree canopy and don't have the same connections to nature. So Richmond's starting to do something about that. Here's an image of LeVar Stoney, the current mayor. He's already actually created 5 new parks in underserved neighborhoods in that city. Another film that we have that demonstrates the power of parks in underserved neighborhoods, the story of Cully Park in Portland. We have a set of metrics for evaluating what a biophilic city is. I want to make just the point that it's not just the presence or absence of nature, but also the things that people do, the ways they engage nature, the time they spend outside and watching and listening to birds, for example. It is a multi-species vision. So we have a number of cities, this is Edmonton, that are actively making room for biodiversity and other forms of life. I'm getting to the end. This is Cura de Bat, one of our cities, a city in Costa Rica that has emphasized planting pollinator gardens throughout the city and the idea of giving citizenship to bees, plants, and trees. Vishakhapatnam, our only city so far in India, wonderful story of how they are training stray dogs to help conserve olive ridley sea turtles and protect those turtles. And this is the book that I mentioned, The Bird-Friendly City. It has a lot of stories about how cities are designing spaces and structures and finding room for birds, like this reconstructed chimney that has more than 50 nesting spaces designed for common swifts. So we're collecting codes, biophilic codes, trying to understand best practice, trying to understand how cities are funding, paying for and funding the nature, the investments in nature, and lots of really wonderful innovations. Use of carbon credits in Austin, Texas. Austin's in our network. Washington, D.C., the first city to use the tool of an environmental impact bond, which has generated $25 million that they've used to invest in stormwater. Go to our website, biofilic.cities.org. Lots of material there. We have an online journal called Biophilic Cities. All the issues are online. Our cities are doing city-to-city exchanges. I've mentioned the films and a new film about Gotham whale, the emergence of whales in New York and the waters of New York. And we have a crowdsourced a global Biophilic Cities pattern book. That's a new project on the webpage as well. Okay, I'm at the end, I promise. Lots of resources, books I've mentioned, and films. This latest book, The Handbook of Biophilic City Planning and Design, another Island Press book, just recently translated into Chinese. And that's it. So your task, among other things, is to do visit the webpage. Even though I've talked a lot about partner cities, you can join the network as an individual, just going to the webpage, signing a pledge, and putting in your contact information, and then you'll get all the emails, and you'll be kind of part of the network. Okay, so that's it. Sorry to go a little bit long, and I'm going to stop sharing my.
No, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. The images were lovely and much inspiration there. So I do want to go through a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
And first of all, I would like to mention that I'm glad that you mentioned the social equity aspect of it, yeah, because a lot of the pre-submitted questions I got from you students kind of touched on that theme in one way or the other. Okay. Or how do you pay for it? Or what do you do in underserved communities that traditionally just aren't thought of when a municipality is trying to green itself?
Right.
So thank you for touching on that. And I'm just trying to make the students aware that, yes, I listened to you. Your questions were great. So the other question I had was, I'll now start off with a question that was submitted by Duncan about the virtual nature.
Oh yeah.
And Duncan, I'm gonna tell you, this was your fault, because I spent more time than I really should have last night on the Windows Swap website, and it just is a series of images and videos that people submit that show their window and their view out their window.
Right.
And it was absolutely fascinating. So I'm gonna put that up there. Time frittered away while I was doing that, but it was very, very interesting. So So Duncan, do you want to pose
Yeah.
your question about that? Or if you don't have it in front of you, I can read it off.
No, I've got it here. I can read it off.
Okay.
So you touched on this a little bit, particularly in with the sounds of bird, but during the pandemic, the virtual nature experiences have seen more focused support.
Right.
And so I'm interested in, are the virtual nature experiences a key part of long-term biophilic design? And can you speak to how these virtual experiences might either influence concerns over equitable green space or incentivize continued non-resilient and unsustainable land use? Because, we can do it in the matrix,
Oh, I see. Wow. Okay. Yes. So there is we have lots of examples of creative delivery of nature experiences in the virtual realm. I mean, it's everything from has anybody been through the there's a part of the Atlanta airport where there's a sort of a multi-sensory experience. You walk essentially through if you stand there long enough, it goes through a cycle of a tropical storm with rain and birds flying above, and it actually a fairly expensive installation. But it's everything from that to, watching something on your computer, watching a nature show, or a virtual window. We're doing a lot of things in hospitals that are, with nature on some kind of a loop. And there are companies now that that will have real-time, virtual clouds in dental offices and places like that. So there has been a fair amount of evidence about the stress reducing. It provides many of the same benefits as real or actual nature, but generally the story is the benefits are not as great. So if you are trying to figure out how to bring nature into a windowless cancer center hospital, where people are getting radiation therapy or something, there are a lot of ways of doing it, but they are generally not as powerful or as effective as real nature. That means we've evolved to such a degree, that our eyes are attuned to that fine movement of a leaf fluttering on a real tree, and it's hard to simulate that. So it's somewhere in between there. I would argue that it's a strategy we need to use, particularly in those places where we can't get people outside, and where real living nature, or some combination of real and virtual. I have a colleague, Sue Thomas. I don't know if any of you have seen her work, but she's coined this term technobiophilia, and look her up. She's wonderful. She's written a whole book about these ideas, and she makes the argument about the internet is a biophilic experience, or it can be. We're on Twitter, and it's the World Wide Web, and she makes some good points and ways of kind of transforming your, all the time we're spending online, making it more of a biophilic kind of experience. So there's power, and that technology can help us definitely, and it can also help us in experiencing real nature, right? So everybody's phone is a tool that can help us to see where we can go, and augmented sort of reality programs that let us know what species of bird was that just went by my window, or whose call I just heard. So there's a lot of power there. I don't know about the second part of your question. If I don't hear a lot of people saying to me, we want to put that virtual window in, and therefore we don't need that park, or we don't need that actual natural system, or that it's more of a supplement. It's part of the matrix, that one slide of indoor outdoor matrix of nature experiences. So I don't know that I'm super worried about that. I think if you talk to somebody like Richard Louv, he would say he's more worried about the time drain from virtual, right? That kids continue to spend, and now, of course, everything is online. So much time that we don't have the time to take a walk or to spend time outside. So it's a good question. I don't have a great answer for the second part of it, but it's something to ponder.
Great. So thank you. That was a great answer, great question. I'm going to pose a rather practical question from Christian Snellgrove. Do you want to talk about your first bullet? Christian, are you out there? There you are.
Yeah, sure. So the question was kind of what the definition of nature that you're using in a lot of a lot of your speech and a lot of your writing. I know kind of because the context, like the personal context was like I spent my winter break in St. George, Utah, a beautiful southwestern area. But then a lot of people, like on their single family house plots, turn their yards into either some sort of artificial turf or vegetation and grass that's not native to the area at all, instead of opting for like some natural xeriscaping or something like that.
Yeah.
And then so you kind of hear that, nature, quote unquote, used as kind of a justification for why this type of development is good, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think there are kind of multiple strands that maybe we can disentangle. The first is to acknowledge that nature is an ambiguous concept, right? And it is to a large degree, it's a socially constructed concept. So part of what we're trying to do really is to change the way we think about nature. That's part of what we're trying to do with this network. So nature is not just wilderness, there is no such thing as wilderness really, but we have this, Wilderness Act 1964 sort of definition: pristine, distant, remote. We go there and we leave. It's nature is a place where we don't belong. We just visit and we leave it. We put a fence around it or something, and we go there. But that image of Richmond, Virginia, a dense city in the midst of a wild river with the shad running and osprey flying, and it's a wild place. It's not wilderness, but it's natureful. And so part of what we're trying to do is expand what we think of as nature. The question about a kind of suburban, exurban lawn, we have a lot of examples of buildings that have turf grass roof. That anything that's growing is good, but we wouldn't advocate that. We would want something more biodiverse, bird friendly, native plants, and we're big advocates of the work of Doug Tallamy. I don't know if you know his name at all, but he's been stridently arguing that we need to reimagine the American lawn, and we have 40 million acres of single species turf grass, biological desert, energy intensive, water intensive, a tremendous opportunity. And he argues that we should, if every homeowner took half their lawn and converted it to a wild native garden, we'd have the largest national park ever, And so that's closer to what we're advocating. And so I'd have a hard time. I'd be very skeptical of that homeowner's argument that that's nature. That said, nature is all around us, and this wonderful team at NC State, Rob Dunn. I don't know if you've had any interaction with him at all, but who's written this book, Never Home Alone, who's done all this work with the biodiversity of indoor spaces and houses, and it's remarkable. Kind of the microbial and other diversity that we have all around. We are living human. Our bodies are ecosystems. So I mean, there is a lot of biodiversity all around us wherever we are, and that's nature too. We are a part of nature. But I'm not a great fan of turf grass suburban lawns, and I would respectfully nudge that homeowner to think differently. But it's a good question.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then I think I'm going to squeeze in one more. So, Matt,
only one more.
Well, people can
I've
stay.
taken too
Tim
much
has
time.
offered.
Yeah,
But I'm going to let you go. If you have to leave right at 5, you're fine. You're
right.
not going to be dinged for it at all, of course.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if you want to stay on, then
and you all could email me later too if you.
Oh, you were terrific.
If something occurs to you later on, that's fine.
Definitely. Oh, that sounds so great. So, Matt, maybe you can squeeze in your second bullet, and if you don't have it in front of you, I'll read it out.
Yeah, that would be great if you could do that. Thank you.
Okay. So you wrote, there are considerable obstacles that remain in making cities more natural and natureful. Some of these obstacles are social and cultural, while others are economic and legal. Is it possible to have a fully biophilic city design under capitalism?
Oh, yeah.
Good loaded question.
Yeah, just to clarify for everybody, that first little bit of that did come from Tim's writing. I did not say that.
Yeah. I mean, we're
it was
very
in quotes.
quite clear that that we do. This is not going to be easy, and it isn't easy. And we have no perfect. I've been talking about Singapore, but there's no perfect story, and they have their own obstacles. But it is a whole.
But they also have a pretty high standard of living, from what I understand.
Very high standard of living. They have, on every health metric, they're way above us.
Well, that's not saying much.
Well, that's not saying much. That's true. But I think Americans have a hard time appreciating that. What? I mean, their life expectancy is considerably higher than we're way down there, and they're like number 3 or something. They had 8 deaths from COVID. It's a population of 5.6 million people and 8 deaths. I mean, this is just astounding. So they're doing a lot of things right. And they've gone in one generation from third world to first world. I mean, it's really a remarkable story. And the investment in nature has been a big part of that. They are also very much a capitalist. I mean, what they've had is, of course, a unitary, a kind of prime minister who was in power for 30 years, and you can get a lot of things done, right, if you've got that kind of top-down, less democratic political system. That would be a very legitimate critique about Singapore. But so there are lots of challenges. You're right. I mean, economic, political, social, reimagining the lawn. We just talked about that's a cultural, aesthetic change. A big obstacle. Just the way we think about cities, right? You don't think about cities as natural systems. That's going to take some work. The question about capitalism and markets, I'm a big proponent of, shifting towards models of consumption that, or a model of capitalism that's more humane and equitable and more democratic, kind of system where we've got more worker-owned companies and all the things that tend to be talked about when we imagine a different, not a socialist, but a closer to a democratic socialist party kind of approach that you find in a European country like Denmark or the Netherlands or Scandinavian countries. And with that goes a lot of things that are complementary, I think, to the biophilic vision. One of them would be more time, a shorter work week, for example, but more time to spend in nature, more emphasis on incorporating nature into the educational system and schools and so on. And so I think there's some complementarity there. I'd be interested in your reaction based on your question. What do you think? I mean, but if it's the observation that we have a global capitalist system that is, and it is, built around fast capital, right? It's fast profits. Capital bounces around the planet really fast, eats up everything. The best forest is the one that's deforested, consumed quickly, profit extracted, and moves on to something else. We don't, that can't be the model that we want. So we've got to figure out what are the economic, alternatives to that. And there are a lot of them out there, sort of donut capitalism and other competing models that are just inherently better for us, better for the planet, and are going to be more complementary to this vision of green and biophilic and natureful cities. But it's a whole big topic, but a really good question, I think. What do you think? Forgotten.
Mad. It was mad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
Short answer would be no, because capitalism is inherently extractive insofar as it's growth oriented.
That's right.
The goal of capitalism is to accumulate
Right.
more and more. And like the end of that is sort of that some people get to experience social benefits while others don't. So my question would be,
Yeah.
under even like a reform capitalism, like the more Nordic model, are
Right.
marginalized people in the global South, do they get to experience this? Obviously Singapore is a unique example. Could go on and on. I won't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's no simple answer to it. It's, but I do think that I often get the question, a little bit different question, but a question of, well, what are these design and planning ideas? What do they say? How do they work in the developing world or in the global South? And it's really great that, London and New York and San Francisco can do all these wonderful, fancy green things. But how does it help, the bulk of the world? And how does it help, especially the millions of people living in informal settlements, in sort of dire conditions of. And my usual answer is that is in those environments where these ideas have the most potential to make a difference. When you think about where nature could have the biggest impact, and again, where we could be doing multiple things through investments of nature, we can be cleaning water, and we can be giving folks the ability to grow some food. It can be, so this is another dimension to resilience, of course, and it is the social equity, global equity dimension that's really important in this discussion as well. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but and I don't know that our model of our vision for a biophilic city is necessarily going to result in changing, the fundamental background economic and social conditions of the planet. But it could help. So it's a really good question.
Super.
You'll have to figure that out the rest of the semester. I hope maybe you have a speaker that speaker who will tackle it.
Maybe I'll have Matt as a speaker.
Yes.
Full of ideas. This is great. Again, I'm going to make the offer. You may leave whenever you like. It is 5:07, so you've done your due diligence in appearing in class. But if Tim is willing to,
I'll be offended if you leave, but don't worry. No, I'm kidding. I won't do that.
Okay, look, Okay, we got
Anybody
a
else?
couple people who have other things they've got to get done.
Yeah,
I know it's a funny time of day also towards the end. If there's
right. No,
anybody
completely
out there
understand that.
still, you want
That's
to,
a burning question or a
right,
comment.
a burning question or
Love to hear your
comment,
comments too.
put it, let's see. My chat somehow disappeared. So I don't know where it is. Just
I guess I just have a quick. I guess
go,
like
Kels.
could you maybe talk about your research that you got a recent grant for regarding COVID and kind of like transportation within cities and people spending time in green spaces and how that's changed. Like what kind of work you guys are doing on that?
Yeah. Well, that was we've gotten a little grant from, we have this Resilience Institute here at UVA, and sort of a quick response, a little bit of funding, not a lot, to help us to collect information, data, stories in real time about what cities are doing. That slide that showed the San Francisco slow streets. And so it's been, at this point, largely just collecting. We're supposed to be writing a book about kind of best practice. But we're utilizing our network and the contacts we have in our 24 cities, but we're also trying to kind of harvest stories from other cities. So I'm not sure that I can tell you much more than I already have about it's a little early for us, basically, to give conclusions about it, except that we are uncovering lots of cool things, but you probably, you're hearing about them too.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things that, that you are reading in the paper about what.
So what kind of data would you say you guys are collecting, I guess? Or is it more like story-based, like interviews and stuff? Or is it, I saw something about maybe like cell phone records or something like that.
Yeah, well, I can't really tell you much at this point. We actually had a meeting yesterday about how we can extract information from social media, and how Twitter, how it might be really interesting to try to understand Twitter comments in cities, pandemic related comments connected to how people are using the nature or enjoying the nature around them. We're figuring out how to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be some value in that. But so far, this has really just been very exploratory, just basically trying to, whether it's something we read in a newspaper or an email somebody sent us about some cool thing that they're doing, somewhere in the world. We're just really just collecting all that now. So,
well, thank you. I hope
that's
all
stay tuned.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And there are, I should say, I'm kind of minimizing it a little bit, but I have a little bit of a team here. They actually have done a series of emails about some of the findings. And actually, if you join, let's see, how would you get those though? Well, we actually have a pandemic page that should have the sort of email reports that our team has sent out. So they're like 4 or 5 emails that these are listserv, kind of like blog posts, basically, of things that we've learned so far. Mm-hmm. But it's nothing groundbreaking. I think it's still too early for us.
Well, thank you.
Sure.